The minefield was designed to keep people out. Every soldier on both sides of that line understood the rule. You did not go in, not for orders, not for medals, not for a friend, and certainly not for a man who had been trying to kill you since dawn. The mines in that field were not built to kill cleanly. They were designed to wound, to detonate at ankle height, driving shrapnel upward through legs and hips and everything above them, to leave a man alive, screaming, stranded between the lines, where his voice could carry to both sides. The idea was that someone might hear him and come in after him, and then the next mine would take them too. Every soldier in that forest understood this. Friedrich Lengfeld understood this. He walked in anyway, for a man he had never met, a man he could not name, a man whose country had sent him across an ocean specifically to kill Friedrich Lengfeld and everyone standing beside him. He walked in anyway, and the mine that ended his life was planted by his own side. To understand what Friedrich Lengfeld did on the morning of November 12, 1944, you need to understand where he was doing it. The Hürtgen Forest, 200 square miles of ancient, dense woodland pressing hard against Germany's western border, hard against the Siegfried Line, the last major defensive barrier before the Rhine. The trees were old and packed close together, their canopies so thick that even at noon the light barely reached the ground. It turned the forest into something between a tunnel and a trap. Dark at midday, cold in October, silent in the way that made the noise, when it came, far worse than anything happening in open country. American soldiers had a name for it: the Green Hell. The U.S. First Army began pushing into Hürtgen Forest in September 1944. By February 1945, 5 months later, they were still fighting inside it. What commanders had estimated would take days took half a year. What looked manageable on a map became, on the ground, a systematic destruction of men and units and anything resembling forward momentum. Here is a number most people have never heard. More than 33,000 American casualties in the Hürtgen Forest. Killed, wounded, captured, missing. Over 33,000 men. That number is larger than the American losses at Guadalcanal. Larger than many of the Pacific Island battles that fill the history books, the museum exhibits, and the war films your grandparents watched. Almost no one knows this battle's name. The forest swallowed those men whole. There were no iconic beach landings here. No famous photographs. No single moment that lodged itself in the cultural memory of the war. Just 5 months of men dying in the dark, under trees that became weapons when artillery shells hit the canopy and exploded downward, raining shrapnel on his soldiers who had no cover and nowhere to go. Whole battalions were ground down to nothing. Units that entered intact came out as fragments of themselves. Officers were replaced so rapidly that soldiers sometimes did not know the name of the man giving them orders. The forest took rank, took experience, took everything methodically, and gave nothing back. There is a particular cruelty to fighting in dense forest. In open terrain, you can at least see what is coming for you. In a forest like Hürtgen, the enemy could be 20 feet away and invisible. Artillery arrived without warning because the tree cover made observation nearly impossible. You could not dig in properly because the roots were too thick and the shelling too constant. You moved, you stopped, you moved again, and at every step the ground might be mined and the trees might be booby-trapped and the man behind you might go down before you heard the shot. Men broke in Hürtgen Forest who had not broken anywhere else. It was into this forest, into this particular darkness, that a 23-year-old German lieutenant named Friedrich Lengfeld arrived in early October 1944. He had been given command of 2nd Company, Fusilier Battalion, 275th Infantry Division, Wehrmacht. He was not the first man to hold that command. 2 officers had commanded 2nd Company before him that autumn. The first lasted a matter of days. The second lasted a matter of days. Friedrich Lengfeld looked at that pattern and understood exactly what it meant. He took the command anyway. That decision, made quietly, without ceremony, in a forest that was already full of graves, tells you something about Friedrich Lengfeld before the main story has even begun. Not recklessness. He had survived the Eastern Front, which was proof enough that he understood odds. He was not naive about what war did to men's bodies and what it did to their minds. He had been wounded, more than once, in a theater so savage that the numbers involved still resist easy comprehension. He was not a man who miscalculated the danger. He took the command anyway, held it for 5 weeks, and on a morning of November 12th, he was still alive. Friedrich Lengfeld was born on September 29th, 1921, in Grunfeld, East Prussia, a settlement in a region that no longer exists under that name, in a country whose borders and identity would be unrecognizable by the time the war ended. He grew up during the years when Germany unmade itself and remade itself into something else. He was 17 when German tanks rolled into Poland. By the time he was old enough to be sent into combat, the front was not in one place. It was everywhere, and it was moving. He served on the Eastern Front before Hürtgen. That fact alone tells you a great deal about the kind of soldier he was, because the Eastern Front did not send its survivors west in any ordinary condition. It changed the men who passed through it in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. The Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union was not like any other theater of the Second World War. It was a war of annihilation, prosecuted with a deliberateness that the Western campaigns, for all their violence, did not match. Millions of soldiers dead or captured on both sides. Entire cities erased. The systematic starvation and murder of prisoners of war on a scale that has no equivalent in modern Western European conflict. Village burned. Populations displaced, enslaved, or shot. Men who survived prolonged combat on the Eastern Front tended to emerge as one of 2 things. Either they were hollowed out, emptied of the capacity to register the humanity of the people around them, because registering it would have made survival impossible, or they came back to something harder and quieter than the men they had been before. A bone-deep clarity about what mattered and what was simply noise. We don't have Friedrich Lengfeld's letters. We don't have his testimony. What we have is the record of what he did. And what he did on the morning of November 12th, 1944, is not the behavior of a man who had lost his ability to recognize another human being as a human being. But before we reach that morning, you need to understand the ground between the lines. The Germans had mined the approaches to their positions throughout Hürtgen Forest. Minefields were laid in careful patterns by military engineers, mapped in detail, named because soldiers name everything, even the things designed to kill them, because naming a thing is a way of pretending you control it. The minefield between Friedrich Lengfeld's position and the American forward line had a name. Wilde Sau, wild boar. Antipersonnel mine, not anti-tank. Not designed for vehicles or equipment, designed specifically for human beings and specifically not to kill them outright. The device detonates at low height. The force goes upward, through the feet, through the ankles, through the knees, through whatever is above them. A man hit by one of these mines does not typically die immediately. He goes down. He loses the use of his legs. He is in tremendous pain. He is unable to move under his own power, and he makes noise. That is not an accident. That is the design. Because a man making noise in a minefield is not just a casualty. He is a mechanism. His voice carries across the open ground to the people who fought beside him. And those people, if they hear him long enough, might make a decision that the engineers who laid the field anticipated and planned for. They might come in after him, and then something happened no one expected, or rather, something happened that was entirely expected, because on the morning of November 12, 1944, Wilde Sau was working exactly as designed. The morning of November 12, 1944, the 12th U.S. Infantry Regiment launched an assault before full daylight to retake a lodge position that German forces had seized the previous morning. The Americans pushed through the trees, through mud that weeks of artillery and November rain had churned into something with no resemblance to ordinary ground. They pushed under fire into German positions they could not always see, using compass bearings because the canopy had taken away the sky. The assault failed. They fell back, not in the orderly fashion that the word withdrawal implies, but in the way units fall back when things go wrong fast and in the dark. In fragments, in confusion, men moving through terrain they could not fully see, trying to find lines they could barely locate, moving away from fire they could not always identify the direction of. During that withdrawal, one American soldier broke the wrong direction. He ran directly into Wilde Sau. The mine went off. He went down. He was alive. The device had done exactly what it was built to do. He was somewhere in the field, wounded badly enough that he could not get himself out. He was between the lines, and he began to call for help. From his position at the German line, Friedrich Lengfeld heard him. What Lengfeld did in the next few seconds, before he did anything else, before any plan had formed, is the clearest window we have into who he was. He gave an order to his men. Not one shot would be fired at any American medic who approached Wilde Sau. If the Americans sent people to help their soldier, Lengfeld's men would hold fire and let them come. No regulation required this. No superior officer had instructed it. There was no military rationale for offering safe passage to the enemy in the middle of a battle. Friedrich Lengfeld made a unilateral decision, in the field, under his own authority, that a man crossing open ground toward a wounded soldier was not a combatant in that moment and would not be treated as one. He was extending the rules of war further than the rules of war required him to extend them. In a conflict where that kind of decision could earn you a court-martial. In a conflict where it sometimes did. And then he waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. 3. The American in Wilde Sau was still alive. Still making sound. Why didn't help come from the American side? It is worth staying with that question, because the easy answer, that no one tried, that the man was simply abandoned, is almost certainly wrong and unfair to the men on the American line. The tactical reality of a failed assault in Hürtgen Forest was chaos. Unit leaders were accounting for casualties, trying to hold positions they had barely managed to reach, trying to understand the shape of what had just happened before the Germans could exploit it. The ground between the lines was dangerous and unclear. Sending medics into a known, active minefield to reach one man, while German positions were operational on the other side, required a calculation that no one could make cleanly from the information available. The math of war is not the same as the math of conscience. But the man in Wilde Sau did not know any of that. He only knew that he was there, in the cold and the mud, with a body torn open by a mine, and that no one was coming. Friedrich Lengfeld kept waiting, kept listening. His men kept watching him. We have no account of what passed through his mind during those hours. No letters, no testimony from men who stood near him that morning and survived long enough to describe it. What we have is the consequence, the moment when 3 hours or 4 hours had passed, and it was clear that no help was crossing from the American side, and the decision he made in response to that clarity. But let's not rush past the waiting itself, because those hours matter. Friedrich Lengfeld had survived the Eastern Front, a theater where the sheer scale and constancy of death demanded a kind of protective numbness from every man who passed through it. You could not feel every casualty individually. The arithmetic was too large. The men who managed to stay functional in that environment did so partly by developing a capacity not to register each individual death as a death. It was a survival mechanism. It was also what the Eastern Front required of you. And yet here was Friedrich Lengfeld in a forest in western Germany in November 1944, unable to stop hearing an enemy soldier in a minefield, unable to make that sound into background noise, unable to file it under the category the Eastern Front had taught him to use for things he could not change. That is not numbness failing him. That is something else holding. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, after the better part of 4 hours, Friedrich Lengfeld made his decision. He assembled a small rescue team. Medics, Red Cross vests, Red Cross flags. He told them where they were going. He told them what they were going to do. And then he told them he was going first. The edge of the road. That is where the safe ground ended. On one side, solid earth, the road, his men standing behind him. On the other side, Wilde Sau, the field that had already taken one man that morning, had done exactly what it was designed to do, and was waiting. Lengfeld stepped off the road. We should resist the urge to make this cinematic. This was not a charge, not a dramatic sprint across open ground. It was a man walking with absolute deliberateness, watching the surface of the earth with every step he placed, in a field where one miscalculation meant death or the kind of permanent injury that would follow a man for the rest of his life. Cold morning air, mud, the sound of someone ahead of him, still alive, still making the sound that had refused to become background noise. His medics followed him in, single file, watching his footsteps. The Red Cross flags were visible above the field. Anyone with a line of sight to that ground, from either side, would have seen them. The universal signal, the one that cuts across every language and every ideology of war. We are not fighting right now. We are trying to reach someone who is hurt. Lengfeld moved forward. Step by careful step, he crossed the open ground of Wilde Sau. The American soldier was somewhere ahead of him. He was getting closer. He reached the position directly opposite the wounded man. He was close enough now that this was almost a real thing. A German officer actually reaching an American soldier in no man's land, actually bringing him out. He made the choice to keep moving, and then the ground gave out. A second mine, hidden at the position where a rescuer's foot would naturally fall when moving toward the first casualty. It is a technique, a deliberate feature of certain minefield designs. A primary device to wound the first man. Secondary devices placed for whoever comes in after him. Friedrich Lengfeld knew about this technique. He was a German officer, operating in a forest his own army had mined. He understood how Wilde Sau was built and what it was built to do. He walked in anyway. The explosion threw him. Shrapnel tore into his abdomen and chest, deep catastrophic wounds. His medics reached him and pulled him back to the road. He was still alive, but the damage was the kind that a forest aid station in November 1944 could not repair. The kind that required a surgical team and facilities that did not exist on a German frontline position in Hürtgen Forest. He was carried first to the dressing station at Lucas Mill, then transported to the main station in Freudsheim. 8 hours after he stepped off that road, Friedrich Lengfeld died. He was 23 years old. He never found out what happened to the American soldier in Wilde Sau. Here is the question that sits at the center of this story. Who was the American soldier in Wilde Sau? We do not know. In the decades since the battle, historians, veterans organizations, military archivists, and descendants of men who fought in Hürtgen Forest have searched through the records of the 12th U.S. Infantry Regiment for November 12, 1944. They have looked for a name, a casualty entry, a medical record, A line in a unit diary mentioning a soldier wounded by a mine during the withdrawal that morning. Nothing conclusive has ever been found. The chaos of a failed assault in dense forest terrain produced the kind of records that chaos always produces. Incomplete, contradictory, fragmented by the same urgency that made careful documentation impossible. The man's identity was swallowed by the mourning that made his story worth telling. Did he survive? We don't know. When Lengfeld fell, his small team was without its leader inside an active minefield. Did they pull back immediately? Did they attempt to reach the American again? Did the American, by some combination of willpower and luck, drag himself far enough out of the field to be recovered by his own men after dark? Did he lie there through the rest of that day, through the night that followed, until the cold finished what the mine had started? We don't know. And here is the version of this story that is hardest to sit with. If the American soldier survived, if he was eventually found and evacuated, if he spent weeks or months in a military hospital and came out the other side, he may have returned to the United States carrying a wound and a story he could only partially tell. He knew he had triggered a mine in Hürtgen Forest. He knew he had been wounded and left in no man's land. He may or may not have known that a rescue attempt had been made, but he almost certainly did not know who made it. He may have grown old. He may have built an ordinary life, a house, a job, a family, the slow accumulation of years that survivors of war sometimes manage to build over what they went through. He may have died peacefully, surrounded by people who loved him, without ever knowing about the order to protect American medics, without knowing about the hours of listening, without knowing about the Red Cross flags and the careful walk into Wilde Sau and the 23-year-old German officer who did not come back out. The most anonymous act of courage in the entire Battle of Hürtgen Forest has no resolution. The man it was performed for has no name. 50 years passed. The war ended. Germany was divided and then, decades later, reunified. The Hürtgen Forest grew back over its shell craters and its graves, slowly, the way forests do, the way nature reasserts itself over the sites of human destruction if given enough time and enough silence. The men who had fought there got old. Most of them did not talk much about Hürtgen Forest because there was not much about it that translated into ordinary conversation. It was not a famous battle. It did not have a clean narrative arc. It was just a place where a very large number of young men went into the trees, and a great many of them did not come back out. And the ones who did carry it in ways that don't have names. Friedrich Lengfeld was buried in the Hürtgen War Cemetery, among the German dead of that campaign. His grave was there. His name was in the records. But outside of the people who had fought near him, he was unknown. In October 1994, a group of American veterans made the drive into the Hürtgen Forest. They were old men, the youngest of them approaching 70, some considerably older. They had been young once in these trees. They had been lieutenants and sergeants and privates in these exact woods, 50 years earlier, when the mud was fresh and the shells were falling and the men next to them were dying. They were led by retired Major General John Ruggles, who had served as a lieutenant colonel with the 22nd Infantry Regiment during the battle. He had fought in this forest when Friedrich Lengfeld was still alive. He had been on the other side of the line. They had brought something with them. A stone marker, inscription, a name. On October 7th, 1994, at the Hürtgen War Cemetery, these American veterans dedicated a monument to Leutnant Friedrich Lengfeld of the Wehrmacht. It is believed to be the only monument erected by American veterans to honor a German soldier from the Second World War. On German soil, paid for and placed by the men of the country he had been fighting against. Pause on that. These are not diplomats, not politicians gesturing toward reconciliation at a summit. They were old soldiers who had come back to a forest they had spent 5 decades carrying inside them, carrying the weight of what had happened here and the weight of the friends they had left here. And they had decided to do something that no protocol required and no one had asked them to do. They erected a monument to a German officer who had walked into a minefield to save an American soldier. Because some things, apparently, outlast the wars that produced them. Because 50 years was long enough, and maybe also not nearly long enough, but it was what they had. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest has been described by the historians who have spent time with it as a strategic mistake, a campaign waged for objectives that were either misunderstood or not worth the cost, over terrain that neutralized most of the advantages the American military held, resulting in casualties that dwarfed the tactical gains. More than 33,000 American casualties, an unknown number of German dead, a forest that most people alive today have never heard of. What this battle has almost never been called is a story worth telling to a general audience. And that is its own kind of tragedy, because inside the forgetting, a great many individual acts of survival and endurance, and yes, sometimes of extraordinary humanity, have been forgotten alongside it. Friedrich Lengfeld is one of them. 23 years old, survived the Eastern Front, took a command that had already killed 2 men before him, held it for 5 weeks in a forest that specialized in killing officers, and on a morning of November 12, 1944, heard an enemy soldier screaming in a minefield and could not make himself stop hearing it. A man who died not in combat, not killed by an enemy, but in a field of his own army's mines, trying to reach someone he owed nothing. What do we do with that? There's a version of this story that resolves into something comfortable. A lesson about shared humanity, about the essential decency that persists even in the worst of circumstances, about how war cannot entirely extinguish the impulse to help another person in pain, no matter which side of the line they are on. And that reading is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Because the other thing the story tells us, the harder thing, is about what it costs. Friedrich Lengfeld did not survive his act of humanity. He did not come home. He did not get the redemption arc, the reunion, the chance to shake the hand of the man he saved. He died 8 hours after he stepped off that road. He was 23 years old, and he died in a forest dressing station in Germany, in a war that would end in 6 months without him. And the man he died for has no name. That absence, the unnamed American, the unresolved outcome, the question that has no answer, is not a flaw in this story. It is the story. It is what makes it true rather than tidy. Because real acts of courage do not come with guaranteed outcomes. They do not come with the promise that the person you're trying to help will survive, or will know what you did, or will have the chance to carry it forward. They come with nothing. Friedrich Lengfeld stepped off that road with nothing except the sound of a man in pain that he could not make himself ignore. War is, among other things, a system built to override exactly that response, to assign the categories, enemy, ally, target, that allow organized violence to function, to train soldiers to respond to the category rather than the individual, to make the screaming eventually background noise. Friedrich Lengfeld's system failed. Or, and this is the version I keep returning to, it didn't fail. He chose, deliberately, with full knowledge of what Wilde Sau was designed to do. He had been a German officer in that forest long enough to know exactly what was in the ground between him and that American soldier. He chose to step off the road anyway, because he could hear someone screaming, and he had decided, somewhere in the 5 weeks in Hürtgen Forest, or the months on the Eastern Front, or the years of watching what this war did to people, that there were things he was not going to give up. That was one of them. What is certain is this. In the middle of a campaign that history has almost entirely forgotten, in a forest that consumed more than 33,000 American soldiers and an untold number of German ones, there is one moment that cuts through all of it. Not a moment about strategy or territory or the arc of the war. A moment about a man standing at the edge of a road in the cold, in November, listening to a sound he could not put down, and stepping off the road. There is a stone in the Hürtgen War Cemetery. It was placed there by old American men who drove back into a forest they had carried inside them for 50 years. It carries the name of a German soldier who died at 23 in a field of his own country's mines, trying to reach an enemy he had never spoken to. The inscription on that stone acknowledges what Friedrich Lengfeld did. It says in the plain language that stone monuments always use that he was here, that this is what he chose, and that the men who came back to set this stone believed it deserved to be recorded somewhere that would outlast all of them. Somewhere in the same history, in the casualty reports that were never completed and the records that were never filed because there was no time and no one who knew what had happened in that specific corner of that specific minefield on that specific morning. There's a name we do not have. An American soldier. A man who ran the wrong direction in the chaos of a failed withdrawal. A man who triggered a mine in a field called Wilde Boar and lay in the cold calling for help. We do not know his name. We do not know if he lived. We do not know if he ever came home. Friedrich Lengfeld has a stone with his name on it, placed there by the soldiers of the country he was fighting against 50 years after the fact, because those men could not let it go. The man he died for does not. Some stories don't end. They just stop. If this story stayed with you, if you find yourself thinking about a minefield in Germany and a name carved in stone by old men who made the long drive back into a forest they had spent decades trying to forget, consider passing it on. There are people who should hear this. History is full of stories like it, buried inside battles nobody talks about anymore, waiting. Hit subscribe if you want more. Friedrich Lengfeld heard someone in pain and couldn't walk away. Neither should this story.